The West Wing is an American television show created by Aaron Sorkin. It's one of my favorite shows, and I'm really excited to have my good friend and colleague at Keith Memorial United Methodist Church on this podcast today to talk about our love for this show. Hello and welcome to the Methodical Methodist Podcast, a podcast where we talk about why the church is still relevant for us today as we explore themes connected to religion, politics, pop culture, faith, and yes, even the church. Together, we can find out what it means to live into the mission of the church by making disciples. Now, let's get methodical. Hello, everyone. I am your host, the Reverend Andrew Lay, and I'm excited to spend this time on the podcast today. If you like the show, I hope that you might take a minute to subscribe, rate, and write a review for the podcast. It helps to boost the show and make it to where more people can find it. You can also find me on Facebook at facebook.com/methodicalpod, and you can find me on Instagram as well at methodicalpod. So be sure to check me out. All right, I'm glad to have my good friend and colleague at Keith Memorial United Methodist Church and Senior Pastor Dave Graybeal here with me to talk about the West Wing. So thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. This is, as you know, one of my favorite things to talk about, so I really appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely, yeah. I've been wanting to have you on for a while now, so I'm glad we can find the time to do it. So I thought we'd just jump right in.
Yeah.
When did you first start watching this show, and what was it about the show that kind of made you start going back to it and become such a big fan of it?
Yeah, so I really started watching The West Wing when it came out in the fall of 1999. It was my last year of seminary in Atlanta, and so my roommate and I, we just sort of fell into watching it. It came out that September, and not only were we, I think, just enjoyed the political aspects of it. I mean, seeing how kind of the government operates, sort of an insider view of what it's like to be at the White House. All of that was very interesting, but I think one of the things I noticed right off the bat was how much there is of a faith element to the show. How different people's faith and the president's faith, different faiths are woven in through all of the episodes. And that really struck me as a seminary student, obviously, that here's a person of faith in the president whose very first words on the show, I mean, the very first episode, they're having a debate about kind of which commandment was the first commandment. And here he comes in and he's quoting the Ten Commandments, the very first commandment. I mean, so for that to be the very first words of the president on this show, I thought was very interesting. But so we kind of tracked that theme all the way through that first season. And then the second season of The West Wing, my wife Tracy and I, we spent 1 year over in England serving a 1-year appointment over there. And one of the things that we were delighted to learn was that the British loved the West Wing. And they're kind of attracted to the presidency in the same way that we're kind of attracted to royalty and wanting to learn more about all of that. So they actually had the West Wing, they broadcast it on one of their like 2 or 3 broadcasting channels, and I think it was maybe a week or 2 delayed from the airing in the U.S., but we were able to continue watching season 2, and then when we got back to the U.S., and when I was appointed here at Keith as the associate pastor, we just picked right up with season 3. The show was on Wednesday evenings and at 9 o'clock. And we had a Bible study that met from 7 until 9. It was the Disciple Bible Study, and several folks who are still at the church were in that Bible study. And I was very we have to end on time because I've got to get back. And I could usually get back to the parsonage, maybe by the time the opening credits would roll. And so we just kind of followed it all the way through. It was 7 seasons, ended in May of 2006. And we just followed it through, and that theme of faith and theology continued to be woven through it. And so that's how I really sort of fell in love with it. The politics and the government stuff was very interesting, but I really was drawn to how are they going to address some of these things from a faith or theology perspective.
That's awesome. Yeah, I heard an interview with Martin Sheen, who talked about when they asked him if he would play the role of the president. One thing that he asked Aaron Sorkin, the writer of the show, was, "Can you make him a Catholic?" Because he wanted to have that part of who he was as a person. He wanted to be able to draw on that within the show, like when it came to different dilemmas within the presidency and how he could maybe play on his Catholicism in the show too. I think that's really interesting. Just going into the show, he had this faith-based idea in mind already.
Yeah, I kind of wonder how much Martin Sheen had to do with that. I know that initially the writers of the show, Aaron Sorkin and the others, kind of wanted the president to be more of a minor figure and wanted to be more about the inner workings of the staff members. Mm-hmm. But of course, Martin Sheen is such a strong presence on screen that it just became more about the president. And but yeah, you see his faith, his Catholicism in particular, in several of the episodes. I know one from the first season has to do with the federal death penalty. And whether he is going to commute the death sentence of this inmate, and he's really wrestling with that from his faith perspective. He in fact calls his priest in, and they have a meeting there in the Oval Office, and he's concerned, like, will his decision be seen as being affected overly by the Pope, and so he's trying to navigate those things theologically as a president, but also as a person of faith. And I think just knowing Martin Sheen and his own activism and his own presence in various things, I know that's a very strong and very genuine aspect of his life.
Yeah, I'm so glad that they made him a regular on the show, big figure, really the main figure of the show. I'm glad that they kept him on in that way, because it added so much to him. Really. So I thought we might, for folks who have not seen the show, which you need to watch the show. But if this can sort of be an invitation for you to watch this show, I mean, I hope that it will. I mean, it's such a great show overall. The writing has been so recommended and recognized as being some of the best TV writing. Phenomenal writing. I think the amount of time you must have spent on those scripts, especially like the first several. I mean, first season really is just. I mean, I don't know how you even do that, but I thought we could look at some of the characters and kind of outline who they are and what they do within the show, and I wanted to do that in a way of pointing out this coffee mug that you actually gave me, that has this thing on it. It says, "Lead like Jed, advise like Leo, think like Josh, speak like CJ, argue like Toby, and write like Sam." And that kind of shows how each of these characters have different skills and abilities and roles that they bring to the table. So I thought maybe we could talk through those characters, who they are, what their role is in the West Wing, and then maybe even talk a little bit about how their roles and their skills can sometimes even be a detriment to them in a way too.
So the characters, and one of the things I've always been impressed by, and I have no idea how the writers chose the names of the characters, but they're either biblically or like historically could be seen as significant. Yeah. So, and starting with the president, I mean, there's Jed is his nickname, Jed Bartlett. but his kind of given name is Josiah Bartlett, which I also think was interesting because there was a Josiah Bartlett who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, who was a governor of New Hampshire, which the president, fictional president Josiah Bartlett, was also before he became governor of New Hampshire. But Josiah was one of the most famous kings of Israel that we read about in the Old Testament. It was under his administration, if you will, that the book of Deuteronomy was found and became the basis for sort of a renovation, a renewal of life within the kingdom of Israel at the time. So I just think that it's interesting that he bears the name of a prominent king of Israel. So Josiah, and leadership is the thing that he does exemplify throughout the series. He's the one who has to make the tough decisions, and I think there's lots of lessons about leadership, what leadership looks like and demands of you. It's very demanding of him. He's torn a lot of times between sometimes what his faith would ask him to do and what his sworn oath to protect and preserve the American people would demand him to do. You see that a lot when he has to respond to acts of terrorism and violence around the world. You know, he has to act, he has to lead in that way. Then you have his wife Abigail, or Abby. She's a medical doctor, but again, Abigail is one of King David's wives in the Old Testament as well, and she's a strong and forceful and wonderful character in the show herself. You have Leo, who is the chief of staff, and again, Leo, there was a famous Pope Leo throughout history who led a lot of the church in really reaching out in some social justice ways, workers, making sure that workers got what they needed. And so, and what is it that Leo does? Advise, yeah. Leo is the one who really convinced Bartlett to run. He wrote it on a little napkin, and one of the great scenes at the very last episode is where Leo's daughter gives President Bartlett that framed napkin. And so Leo, even though he's older than President Bartlett, he is really seen as sort of as Bartlett's kind of conscience. Bartlett really looks to him for advice and counsel, and Leo feels very comfortable to sometimes tell Bartlett what he may not want to hear, but what he needs to hear. And I think that's the mark of a very trusted and good advisor for him. Then you have Toby. Toby's the communications director. He's kind of the main speech writer. And again, there's a great name, Tobias, who's a figure in the apocryphal literature in the Bible, kind of the Bible, part of the Bible that didn't make the final cut in some Protestant versions, but Tobias is a big figure there. And Toby is a observant Jew in the show, and he is he's kind of the melancholic figure there. I remember one time he has an ex-wife in the show, and they're wanting to Toby kind of wants to get back together with her, and she declines, and he's kind of like, well, why? And she says, well, it's because you're sad. But it's kind of a sweet sadness, a melancholy. He's got a depth in his character that I've always appreciated about Toby. He is going to do the right thing. And that it ends up costing him his job at the White House.
One thing I tell Allie about, the thing I like about Toby is he has two levels. It's either he's whispering or he's just yelling. There's no in between.
Yeah. And I also like Toby has this ball that when he's thinking, he bounces it through his office. And so that's just one of the quirks about Toby that I really like. Then for the first 4 seasons, you have Sam, who's kind of Toby's right-hand guy, the deputy chief of communications, who is played by Rob Lowe. And again, there's the name, Samuel, one of the main prophets, early prophets in the Bible. And he's one of the speech writers. I like Sam's character because he's kind of idealistic. He wants to help people, and you see that just in a lot of different ways, both on an individual level. He befriends this young woman who's making her way through law school in a sort of a way of life that might be frowned upon, and he kind of wants to sort of save her and wants to redeem her, and I appreciate that about Sam. But you can also see when other groups are wanting to be petitioning for fair treatment or something, he's very much on the side of kind of the underdog, and so you see that about Sam. And like Sam, right? Right. You want the inspiring speeches that Sam can put together, and so CJ Craig. She is the kind of White House spokesperson. She's the one who meets with all the press at press conferences, and CJ is a wonderful character. I don't know much about her name or her. She goes by her initials, other than it's the reverse of JC, Jesus Christ. I don't know. Maybe that's a stretch. But CJ's fun. She's played by Allison Janney just so well. There's some times when she sings and dances and has fun on the set and in some of the scenes. She is also very much of a conscience figure. She presses Bartlett and some of the other staff members to do the right thing, and she also questions them when they act questionably, because she's the one who has to interpret that and explain that to the press, and so she wants to make sure she gets the story right, but also make sure that it's the right story. And so what did Speak Like CJ?
Yeah, Speak Like CJ. Yeah.
And she handles those press briefings so well. She knows, as I think is true for the real press briefings. I mean, they know the reporters who are sitting in the room. She has one in particular relationship with one of the reporters in the show, but calls them by name, has a good relationship with them. And I always like to see her in action. She can speak on the fly and does really well with that.
And then we've got Josh Lyman.
Oh, Josh, yes. How could I overlook Josh? Josh is I think your favorite character, Josh. Again, what a name, Josh. Joshua, Moses' successor in the Bible, leads the people into the promised land. So Josh is kind of a leader in that regard. He's the deputy chief of staff, I think. He's Leo's sort of right-hand person. And what's the word for...
It's think like Josh.
Think, yeah. So the thing about Josh is he's very savvy. He's very politically savvy. Like, he knows how decisions will play out. He's like a really good chess player who is always thinking 3 or 4 moves ahead. That's Josh. He's always aware of who they need to get on board in the House or the Senate to pass this legislation or move this thing forward. He can sometimes be seen maybe as a little bit cynical, or he's very realistic, though. He knows what needs to be done. And he's played by Bradley Whitford, who's got he's a little sass, a little sarcasm there. And a lot of the laughs come from Josh, but also some remarkably tender moments with Josh. He is at the end of season 1 is shot really in this sort of assassination attempt that ends the first season, and he has some post-traumatic stress, and so some of the episodes deal with him talking with a counselor, and he talks about his sister had passed away in this house fire, and he kind of felt somewhat responsible for not, helping to save her. And so you see, there's a lot more depth to Josh than might first appear. He puts on this tough front, but he's really a warm-hearted. And you see that a lot with his relationship with Donna, who's his assistant, and just the banter they have back and forth is really good. I do want to say one of my favorite characters was only in the first 2 seasons, and that's Mrs. Landingham. That's the president's assistant, sort of, and she is played by this wonderful woman who just wears so much on her face. She, without saying anything, she kind of, this is someone who is older and has known President Bartlett since he was a student. I think she was his father's assistant at the school where he went to. So she doesn't take a lot of things from him. Like President Bartlett doesn't know how to use the intercom on his phone, so he yells, "Mrs. Landingham," and she just has given up on trying to train him to use the phone. But again, she I think plays kind of a conscience figure for her. She dies tragically at the end of season 2 in a car accident. She had just bought her first brand new car with her own money, and then she's hit by this drunk driver. And so it's just this tremendously sad ending to that season, where Bartlett, again, here's his faith coming out, and his sort of upbringing in the Catholic Church, his knowledge of Latin. One of my favorite episodes is called 2 Cathedrals, and it was filmed in the Washington National Cathedral, where they have her funeral, and then after everyone leaves, he's just in there by himself, and he basically has a come to Jesus meeting with God, and just really lambasts God for that. But it's a tremendous scene because Sorkin said he wanted it to be a tribute to faith, to this man's faith, that can make room for expressing doubt and anger and frustration even at God. But Mrs. Landingham, her first name is Dolores in the show, which Dolores it means suffering. It means sorrow. And again, I think some of these names are just so well chosen and so fitting for the characters that they have. So she's one of the minor characters, as is Charlie. Charlie is President Bartlett's personal assistant, personal aide, played by Dule Hill. And there's some great scenes where President Bartlett gives Charlie some things. Like in the first season, he gives Charlie this carving knife that belonged to President Bartlett's family. Turns out it was made by Paul Revere. And Charlie's just so grateful for that. In the last episode, I think President Bartlett gives Charlie his, father's or his family's copy of the Constitution. Charlie's getting ready to go off to law school. So that's a neat relationship, too, that we see there.
I think other than Leo, Charlie has the most direct access to the president than any other character.
Right.
He's the guy who wakes him up in the morning. Yeah. If the president needs to be bothered in the middle of the night, Charlie's the one who goes in and does it. So,
yeah,
absolutely. So, out of those characters, which one do you feel like you connect with the most?
Yeah, that was a great question. And then as I was sort of looking back over my notes from all the episodes, we kind of left out some of the later episodes. Matt Santos is the presidential candidate that I hope we're not giving anything away, but played by Jimmy Smits, and so I found myself resonating a lot with him. He's someone who kind of wants to see the big picture, and Josh becomes his campaign manager, and Josh is always trying to say, no, you got to get to know these people and, press the flesh and get to, work the relationships. But he's kind of wanting to see the big ideas and share that in the big speeches. And I think part of me I think of myself as kind of more of a big idea than the nuts and bolts kinds of folks. But of the sort of main original folks, I've always wanted to be like Sam. I wanted to write inspiring and uplifting, for him speeches, for me, sermons, and to have that kind of sensitivity to what is right for the underdogs. I'll say, though, there's a little bit of Toby's melancholic spirit in there. I think we would always love to have a little bit of the president's decisiveness and leadership and capabilities, but I would say probably I would lean more towards Sam in that. What about you?
I don't know if I connect with him, but he's the one that I'm drawn to the most, and that's Josh. I just like his character, his arc in the story. Like the first episode, you find out that the president has kind of told Leo to fire him, and he's in danger of losing his job, and because of something he said to a Christian evangelist figure on TV. That kind of gave the president some bad press. And so you see him kind of in a precarious place at the first episode. And then, like as you mentioned, the end of season 1, he gets shot. You find out that during the campaign, there's a flashback where Josh's dad dies. And he goes to the airport to go fly to be with his family. And the president is there at the airport.
Yeah.
And Josh is like, what are you doing here? You're running for president. You can't be here right now. You've got to go and do all these other things. So you see that really tender moment with him and the president, kind of where before this, the president's kind of snapping at all the staff and doesn't really know their names and he's kind of like very frustrated with the way things are going. And then you see, with this moment with Josh, you see a bit of a shift in the president. You see him kind of caring for one of his staff in that way. And then you mentioned the PTSD episode. I mean, you just have all these moments that I just felt connected and drawn to Josh. I don't think I'm really anything like him. And that's what makes me want to be like, that's what makes me want to kind of be like him, is because he's so different from who I am. Like, I wish I could just say what I thought and not care what other people think of me, but I'm just not like that at all. So there's a part of me that wishes I could be, maybe not quite exactly like him, but more like that. To just be able to say what's on my mind and really, really kind of go for it. But
yeah, absolutely. Josh is, and I think when they started out to write it, they were really focusing on like Josh and Sam, Sam's character. And you can kind of see how those two are very prominent in the first several seasons. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're kind of drawn to try to relate to them in a lot of ways. Yeah, and they those two team up together a lot, to do whatever the dirty work needs to go down. It would be like send Josh and Sam. So
it's true. Well, one of the things that I really like about the show is how it speaks to the real world. I mean, you have this fictional TV show that mentions things that we deal with in our daily lives and we see on the news all the time. I know we were texting some last night about this, but I watched an episode of The West Wing recently where they were mentioning pandemic, the possibility of a pandemic. And Josh is, I think it's in Crackpots and These Women, where he essentially says, you think it's going to be this big nuclear war, but really it's going to be something like smallpox that's going to take us all out.
Yeah.
This pandemic, that, and I just thought, wow, how crazy is that now we find ourselves in our in our real lives in this global pandemic.
Right.
But there's another episode where the president is quarantined.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, I think that's No Exit, season 5, episode 20.
Yeah,
is that quarantined?
That's the one where maybe they get this envelope with some powder, and they're
Yeah,
not quite sure what
I don't know
it
if
is.
it's anthrax or something like
Yeah.
that. They don't know. But I just think it's so cool how this show talks about things that are so relevant for us today. So, what are some of the connections that you have seen in this fictional show that relates to real situations in our world?
Yeah, so last week the Supreme Court, the real Supreme Court, issued a declaration that had to do with Native Americans on reservations and their systems of justice. And I mean, that's one of the things that comes up in a couple of times in the series. Native American rights and the treaties that we've made with them over the years. One of the things that came up that Sam pressed a lot in some of the early seasons had to do with climate change and trying to get folks to realize the urgency of climate change. I mean, this was 21 years ago that this came out. There's also lots of things that we experience. There's at one point where there's a clash between the administration and Congress over the budget, and they sort of shut down the government. Well, that was well before, I don't know how many shutdowns of the government we've had since then, real shutdowns. And so it kind of helped to interpret and make sense of how that happens, how it could be resolved. You mentioned, the smallpox. There was a mad cow outbreak in one of the episodes. It's one of the things I think it's interesting is I've known of a lot of history and civics teachers in high school who will use episodes or incorporate episodes of The West Wing to talk about some real things either in the Constitution or things like that, or things that are happening now. It's amazing the breadth of the issues that the writers were able to envision, and the ways some of those issues just have persisted throughout time. And it's not so much a matter of that the administration in the show happens to be Democrat and the opposition in the Congress at that point happens to be Republican, but Democrat, Republican, they switch sides all the time. The issues kind of have persisted, and I just think that that's brilliant to see how that has stayed the same. And also, it's interesting to see, cell phones were not a thing then. People had pagers in the show, and so that's a little different. The social media aspect wasn't present in the show, and so you kind of would be curious how they would have dealt with some of those kinds of things. The president in the show, for example, does not tweet. Twitter was not a thing at that point, but it's interesting to see how the issues persist.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's a show that you can almost, it's timeless, I think, because so many people are watching it. People my generation and younger are finding this show out. I remember my parents watching it when I was a kid, and me not understanding anything about. I remember the intro, the music at the beginning, and then I'd just be I don't know what's happening. And then when I got in college is when I really started watching it for the first time, and really got drawn to it because it was just. Other than the few moments where you see them with beepers and pagers and those things that kind of date it, it really speaks to the current times today. It's kind of crazy how well it does that. And
I think one of the greatest compliments that the writers, I can't remember if it was Sorkin or Tommy Schlam, one of the early directors, said, but he said they would get mail from folks, and those who were Democrats would say, we love the politics of the show and we love the show. But they said they would also get mail from those who were Republicans who said, we hate your politics, but we love the show. And I think that really speaks to how it really does sort of elevate the the conversation, elevate sort of the discourse, and I think it presents a White House and government working. They will admit it was very idealized. This is what we would like to think our government looks like. People who really want to try to do the right thing and are trying to work through all the messiness of doing that. But I think that's what was part of its appeal, was that it appealed to what we want our leadership to be about and to look like.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I've got friends who are Republican, and I've got friends who are Democrat, and they all love the show.
Yeah.
It kind of transcends that. And even in the White House, it is very idealistic, you're right. Like it's government at its best, for sure. But you also see, like, the White House, they don't win every fight. No. There are times where things fall off the table, where they have the best intentions, but they can't get it through. They can't make it work.
And they're flawed people. I mean, the president makes mistakes, and to use the religious language, I think that even he uses in the show, I mean, it commits some sins, things that go against what his faith and religion would require of him. So they're all these fallible characters, which I think they are human. They are people we can relate to. But they sort of navigate through that, and they're also very loyal to one another. There's a sense of that they are in this together. There's not a cutthroat or competitiveness among them. They are really trying to be on the same team, pulling in the same direction, and that's encouraging. You want to believe that to be true.
Absolutely. So I know we've mentioned a lot of episodes, kind of as we've talked. Do you have a favorite episode, or at least one that you keep coming back to time and time again, one that you seem to keep watching over and over again?
Yeah. So I do. So I think I have. If you'll allow me, like 3 real quick.
Oh yeah.
So the first one that comes to mind, though, is from the first season. It's In Excelsis Deo, which, again, some of the names of the episodes really are just so telling in terms of faith-based. I mean, you've got In Excelsis Deo, you've got Isaac and Ishmael, you've got Holy Night, In God We Trust, some of these great. But In Excelsis Deo is the Christmas episode of this first season, and that's where we really see it's about Toby. Toby is called to the Washington Mall, the area there by the Washington Monument. There was a homeless person who had died on a park bench there. It was wearing a coat that had Toby's business card in it. So the detective asked, "Do you know this guy?" And Toby's like, "No, I don't know this guy," but he said, "Well, he was wearing a coat that had your card in it." And Toby realizes that he had donated the coat to like a Goodwill, and that this fellow must have been wearing it. And so the detective said, "Oh, that clears it up," and is about to send him away. And Toby realizes that the fellow who died was a veteran of Vietnam, like Toby himself was in the show. And so he starts inquiring, this guy was a veteran, and the detective's like, "Oh, thanks for pointing that out." And he's like, "Well, he should get like a proper burial." So the show is about how Toby arranges a burial for this homeless vet in Arlington National Cemetery. And he jumps like way over his head to make these things happen. And one of the things I've realized, since we've had a church member, last year who was actually buried in Arlington Cemetery, and we've learned that process takes a lot of time. Like it takes 6 months or so, I think. So I don't know how realistic it is, even for a top White House worker to arrange such a thing. But anyway, Toby makes it happen and is kind of called into the Oval Office at the end. President Bartlett's like, "Are we going to now arrange for military funerals for all homeless veterans?" And Toby says, "I hope so." So you kind of see Toby's heart there. And so in the end, he and Mrs. Landingham, who we learn lost both of her boys in Vietnam in the service. around Christmas time. And so you see them, they're just a handful of people at Arlington Cemetery for this burial, and that's the closing scene of that episode. So, it's just very moving. I'm sorry, it was a Korean war vet, and that's why I think my dad was served during the Korean conflict, and so I think that's one of the things that draws me to it. But I watched that episode like on Christmas Day or around Christmas every year, so that is a favorite. Another favorite is one I mentioned just a little bit ago, the two cathedrals in the Washington National Cathedral after Mrs. Landingham's funeral, where Bartlett really has this very in-depth conversation with God. And I think that episode has to do a lot with what faith is, a vigorous faith. I think it also shows what prayer can be, honest, vulnerable prayer can look like. So that's a favorite. And then another favorite is one that was not planned. It wasn't part of the original planning of the show, but it was this Isaac and Ishmael episode, which came out it was aired 3 weeks maybe after 9/11, and it was a one-off episode, and the writers basically have this sort of set up this fictional possible terrorist suspicious figure working in the White House that they have to check out. So they send everyone down to the White House cafeteria. Some high school students were on a tour. They get sent down to the cafeteria. And it's really through their questions, the questions of those students, that gives voice to the questions of Americans in the weeks after 9/11. Who are these folks? Why do they want to kill us? What's the history of this? And so it allows sort of the staff and President and Ms. Bartlett to speak into that in a way that kind of, I think, helps to provide some historical perspective and not to sort of demonize all people of Islam. I think at one point Josh says to compare these terrorists to Islam is like saying the KKK is representative of Christianity. Right. It's like these are extremists, these are not representative of the whole. And I just sort of am very impressed that they were able to pull that together in a matter of, in television time, very quickly. Yeah. And were able to sort of speak an education into the people at that time. I thought that was and then of course the biblical significance of Isaac and Ishmael. I remember how Mrs. Bartlett, Abby Bartlett, at the end says, it kind of all goes back to Isaac and Ishmael, these two sons of Abraham. The Arabs trace their lineage back to Ishmael, and the Jewish Judeo-Christians trace back to Isaac. And they were obviously at odds. They were two different sons from two different women. But she says, but when their father Abraham died, they both came to his burial. And so kinds of ends on this hope that hopefully in the end we can come around together. So it gives some hope, I think. Yeah. So those would be my top three.
That's great.
Do you have a favorite episode?
Oh, I may do three too. I like Crackpot and These Women, or I call it the Big Wheel of Cheese episode.
Yeah.
It's a good story. It's kind of Leo sets up this day for all the White House staff to deal with folks that they would normally never deal with, never take meetings with in the White House. And so it's just I just think it's kind of a funny episode. But one of the things we see Josh deal with is he gets his NSD card or something like that. Yeah. And it's basically like if in the event of a nuclear holocaust or something like that, he gets this card that would allow him to go into this shelter. Yeah. And he's kind of has this internal struggle throughout the whole episode when he realizes that he got this card, but some of the other staff, like Sam, did not get it. And so in the end, he ends up actually giving that card back and just saying, I I can't in good conscience take this. And you kind of see the president and Leo just saying, okay. They kind of respect his decision in that. Yeah. But I like that aspect of that episode. But it's also just funny. You've got like some folks that meet with CJ and they're like, the world doesn't really look the way it does on a map. And she's like, well, what does it look like? And they do kind of like this reconfiguration to show kind of more accurately what the world would look like. And she's like, no, that looks crazy. We're not going to do that. And then I think she also meets with these people who want to build a highway for these wolves. And she's like, that's insane. There's no way we can do that. So it's just kind of funny to see some of these meetings that they take. Particularly like the way CJ handles them is pretty humorous. I really like another Christmas episode is Noel, which is the season 2 Christmas episode where we see Josh deal with his PTSD. He meets with a counselor, and what I love about that episode is at the end of it, he walks into the lobby of the White House, and you can tell that John Spencer, Leo McGarry, has been waiting for him, and he kind of goes through this story. He kind of like tells like it's almost like a joke, where he says this guy's walking. And he falls into a hole, and the walls are so deep he can't get out. And a priest walks by, and the guy yells up, "Hey, Father, you can you help me out? I'm stuck down here in this hole." And he writes out a prayer. He throws the prayer down, and the hole moves on. Doctor comes by. He says, "Hey, Doc, I'm stuck down here in this hole. Can you help me out?" And the doctor writes out a prescription, throws it down, the hole moves on. And then a friend walks by, and he says, "Hey, I'm stuck down here in this hole. Can you help me out?" And the friend jumps down in the hole. And the guy says, "What are you, stupid? Now we're both down here." And the friend says, "Yeah, but I've been down here before, and I know the way out." And then Leo says, "As long as I'm here, you're here." Kind of like I'm gonna take care of you. And I think that's kind of a nod back to the first episode too, where you see the president is ready to fire Josh, and Leo kind of protects him a little bit and kind of tries to wait out that storm and kind of have Josh's back. Still calls him out, still says what you did was wrong, but like he kind of has his back. I just like that story. And then the last one I want to talk about is Take This Sabbath Day, which we've mentioned already too. Season 1, episode 14. That scene at the end where he's meeting with his priest. I guess that was the priest that he grew up with. And they're talking about capital punishment. He tells that story of the flood that comes, and the guy, I can't remember exactly. I think there's a radio call that says, "Hey, there's a flood coming. Find higher ground. Go to safety." And the guy says, "I'm a Christian. God will protect me." Flood rises. Guy with a boat comes by. Says, "Hey, there's a flood coming. Jump in. I'll take you to safety." He says, "No, I'm a Christian. God will protect me." Gets up on the roof. A helicopter comes by. Says, "Hey, come on. There's a flood coming." He says, no, I'm a Christian. God will protect me. Well, then the guy drowns and he dies. And then he goes up to heaven and he's, demands an audience with God. And he says, "God, I'm a Christian. I thought you would protect me." And God said, I sent a radio announcement. I sent a guy in a boat. I sent a helicopter. What the hell are you doing here? And it's just kind of like, hey, you've gotten a priest. You had to talk to the Pope. You've talked to all these people.
Toby's rabbi. And right after that, President Bartlett, you say, "Pray for me, for God to forgive me of this sin." Right. And so, you see that, and that struggle. That's a powerful scene.
Yeah. One of my favorites. But, that kind of leads me into really what I wanted to talk about in this episode or in this podcast the most is you've done a lot of work and writing on specific episodes where you've seen faith play an important role in the show. And I wondered if you might want to talk some about how you've seen faith in that show specifically in different episodes.
Yeah. I just, I think we've talked a little bit about it. I think it's interesting to see the different kinds of faith. I mean, with Toby's Judaism, and there's at one point where he and his wife have twins, and so when it's time for the bris, the ceremony, you see, Bartlett asks Toby, "How was the bris?" and says Mazel Tov. So there's a lot of interreligious respect, I think, that's woven into that. Awareness, knowledge, respect. You see it, I think, brilliantly in the way they treated the Isaac and Ishmael, and Islam generally. And of course, this was in the years of and immediately following 9/11. So they were trying to give voice to some of the frustration and anger that Americans had, but also a sense of what Islam is really all about. One of the episodes I think that really struck me was an episode in season 6, I think it is, called Han. And in that episode, there's a North Korean concert pianist, who comes to the White House, plays a concert, and communicates to the president that he would like to defect. And so that sort of puts the president and the administration in a very difficult position, because they're also trying to negotiate. It's all the politics of it. They're trying to negotiate nuclear agreements with North Korea and China and all this. And so if he defected, that would disrupt that. So they're trying to figure out what to do. But that word Han was a word that I learned in seminary, and it's this Asian concept that's sort of the inverse side of sin. So sin is something that we do to others to wrong them in some way. But Han is the experience of being wronged, of being sinned against, and the sort of ways that can manifest itself, either in resignation or revolution. Either you kind of lay down and become a doormat and resign to the situation, or you rise up and you fight it. And so I just think there's this brilliant awareness of that dimension of faith in another culture, and this is a beautiful vehicle for that story to be told. So I just think there's lots of different ways that we see woven through. We see prayer woven through, the president praying, several people saying to various characters, we're praying for you, but sometimes you get the sense that they're actually praying upon them, like they are praying for them to sort of change their minds and viewpoints about things. But then there's some very genuine prayer. There's a time when President Bartlett visits a VA hospital, and he meets this soldier there. His name is Martinez, and the president asks him, is there anything I can do for you? And the guy says, would you pray with me? And so he does. They pray the Lord's Prayer together. So prayer is important. I think forgiveness is woven through, just like in the first episode. The president kind of forgives Josh. That's another theme that's woven through. You see a wonderful episode on the power to pardon. It's called the benign prerogative, which was actually what Alexander Hamilton called the presidential power to pardon. So there's a Hamilton connection there. But and it talks about what do we do with the forgiveness when it's been offered to us. There's a lot in there about the Bible and the Bible's significance, the Bible's interpretation in lots of different episodes, from seen as simply President Bartlett being handed a Bible to his trying to determine which Bible he wants to use for his second inauguration, to how he and his wife discuss what the preacher said about the relationship between husbands and wives in church one Sunday. There's a lot of talk about Bible. There's a lot of, there are 4 big funerals in the show. And it shows the different characters and different religious figures making sense of and interpreting that. And, that brings up the role of important rituals like that in our lives. There's a lot of communion that happens as well. And so the Mass and sort of those rituals figure in at important times and important ways. So it's sometimes entire episodes will kind of deal with certain things, but then other times it's like woven all the way through and just little bits and pieces. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the way they handled it in both of those ways was really good.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I feel like Aaron Sorkin knows the Bible way better than I do.
Yeah.
The way he's able to just, and you even mentioned he'll name an episode or a certain name, or he just has these little details, even down to like some of the music in the background that's playing in certain episodes. He just is masterful at making those connections. Yeah,
thank you for mentioning the music. There's one, I can't remember what it is, but there's this hauntingly beautiful Jewish Hebrew chant that's over the back of this that's just amazing. Some of the hymns that, for the Thanksgiving, it ends with we gather together. There's the music, it was well chosen too. There's one where I think it's at the end of Two Cathedrals where it's Dire Straits, they play Brothers in Arms, a great song by them. There's a cover of the Hallelujah song that's in one of the episodes. So they've got some great musical taste as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, is there anything you want to add or talk about that we haven't covered?
Gosh, how do you cover 7 episodes, 7 seasons of it? It's a great, if you haven't watched it, I would just encourage folks to watch it and maybe watch it with friends. That was one of the things that I enjoyed with my roommate in seminary, and then with kind of a community of West Wing watchers. Mm-hmm. And there's some great blogs out there, so you can even feel a part of a community, even in when you may be quarantined. But it's well worth the watch. It's educational. I think it's inspirational. It's just a great show all around.
I think one thing that I really like about the show is that it's dramatic, but it's not like, there's not a lot of fluff to it. It's very like substantive.
Yeah.
Very rich. Like there's a lot happening in these episodes, and they're layered, and they've got a lot to say. And I think they really speak to the human condition, and it just does a really good job. It's a show that you have to watch and really pay attention to.
Oh, yeah.
And watch over and over again, because you miss things and you make connections later. And so, watching it with somebody else is recommended for sure, because you can get different people's takes on things. And
yeah, absolutely. Well, as President Bartlett himself would say, what's next?
There we go. Yeah.
One of his favorite lines.
Well, that's actually, so any before I kind of move on, anything else you want to talk about?
No, this is great.
Awesome.
I love it. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, I was going to say, now that you said what's next, I was going to talk about that final scene in the last episode. President and First Lady are flying back to New Hampshire on Air Force One. He served 2 terms as president. He's handed the mantle over to the next guy. And the First Lady, Abby Bartlett, looks over at the president. You can tell he's kind of got things on his mind. He's thinking, he's looking out the window. And she says, "What are you thinking about?" And a guy who's always saying, "What's next?" He just replies, "Tomorrow."
Yeah.
Which I think is just a beautiful way to end the show. You've got this guy who's always asking what's next. His presidency is over, and he's still thinking about what is he going to do next. Yeah. What's tomorrow going to bring? And I think it's such a hopeful message, hopeful tone to end the show on.
Absolutely. That's a great closing episode. Yeah, really wraps it up well. Yeah.
All right. Well, good. I think that's how we'll wrap up this episode too then.
Thanks, Andrew, so much.
Yeah,
enjoyed this.
I appreciate it. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Methodical Methodist Podcast. If you have enjoyed this show, I hope you might consider heading on over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review of the show. It is very much appreciated. And until next time, stay methodical.